Thank you for coming. I think we're it, so we're going to get started. I'm Bob Jolly, Academic Director. Scott Davis, our Development Officer, is filming this event tonight. Thank you, Scott. And thank you for coming. We're really pleased to have Nancy Marie Brown, who is here, and Bill Maris, who is there. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Northeast Kingdom Authors Collection, do a proper introduction of each of our speakers, and then turn the podium over to Nancy. The Athenaeum has created a Northeast Kingdom Authors Collection, and this is one of the 2022 readings in the series. There'll be another reading at the end of this month, and there are flyers on the glass case that also has the collection of both Bill and Nancy's books. The NEK Authors Collection is a permanent gathering of the works of the authors who have lived in one of the three counties that make up the kingdom. While there are books about the kingdom, think of Howard Frank Mosier and Galway Cannell, Virginia Downs, or Beth Cannell. The collection is more about the incredible number of people who have lived here and published books on all manner of subjects, from science to essays and poetry to food and cookbooks to works for children. We are working to identify and collect as complete a record as we can of all the authors who have called this unique part of Vermont home. We have begun with living authors, and in Chris Hatzel's words, recently living authors. And Chris was the genesis of the idea for this program, so full credit to her. So we're starting with people who we know. Many of these people have read here a lot. Nancy has read here before. Bill has read here before, and some of the people we picked last year, Galway Cannell, who read here dozens of times, and Rachel Hattis. People have a connection to the Athenaeum as well. This is an ongoing project. You can see the list of the authors we know about on our website. So if you go there, look for a tab that says NEK Authors, and if you see somebody who's supposed to be on there, because we miss them, I just love it when people show up right after we get going. Please send us a note, because there's a Gmail link on there, and we want to know who we've missed. You'll see some names will be missing because that's a person who actually doesn't live in one of these three counties. They're right down the road somewhere. So there will be people who think, of course they're on this list because they're an NEK author, but they have to have lived in this county, one of the three counties. You can also see, I'll show you later physically where the collection is out here. And if you want to search the collection online, go to the public side, well, the only side you can access, of our catalog. And again, look for an NEK Authors tab, and you'll see who, of all of the authors we've named, how many of their books do we have. The organization of the collection is also unique. This is insider library stuff. You know how it's normally organized. It's fiction, it's nonfiction, and if it's nonfiction, it's a 0, or it's a 900, or it's somewhere in between. This is organized by every book we have of the author, so the collection is alphabetically by author, and then it is organized by publication date. So it's a pretty unique system of showing, at a glance, in the cases of the people whose works we entirely collect, like this is everything they wrote in the order they wrote it. So in some cases, it's children's books, and it's fiction books, and it's nonfiction books, and at a glance, you can see this is their entire writerly career. Tonight, Bill Mayers and Nancy Marie Brown will read from their works. I'm going to introduce them both right now and then get out of the way, and Nancy is going to take over the podium. Bill Mayers was raised in Texas, educated at Harvard, and has been a reporter, photographer, state legislator, and high school teacher. He has authored or co-authored 20 books on subjects ranging from the Marine Corps, desert travel, and war memorials to beer making, beekeeping, and Vermont humor. I'm sure you are all familiar with his books co-written with Frank Bryan, Out, the Vermont Secession book, the Vermont Owner's Manual, and Real Vermonters Don't Milk Goats. And with his many books illustrated by Jeff Danziger, on this day after the midterms, I direct your attention to the full Vermonty, Vermont in the Age of Trump. It's right there on the shelf, you can check it out. Bill is the co-owner of the House of Fermentology, a beer blendery in Burlington, Vermont. He serves on the boards of Food for Farmers and Vermont Digger. He was named Person of the Year by the Vermont Council on World Affairs. He recorded over 175 commentaries on Vermont I will always say Vermont Public Radio, but Vermont Public. His hobbies include singing, fly fishing, and beekeeping. He lives in Burlington with his wife of 50 years, Chris Hadsel, who is here, and they have 2 sons. I'm going to introduce Nancy and get out of the way. Nancy Marie Brown is the author of 9 books, 8 of which are about Iceland and the Viking Age. She is attracted to extremes, medieval literature and modern archaeology, myths and facts. Her work asks, what have we overlooked? What have we assumed? What have we forgotten? Whose history must not be lost? Her books have been favorably reviewed in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Economist, The Times Literary Supplement, developed The Wall Street Journal, The Boston Globe, as well as on National Public Radio. She has over 40 years' experience as a writer and editor. From 1981 to 2002, she wrote about science and university research for Research Penn State, an award-winning magazine published by Pennsylvania State University. There she explored topics as varied as chaos theory, glass preservation, the creation of agates, comets, caterpillars, volcanoes, fractals, Renaissance poetry, digital photography, gambling, sustainability, wild horses, and genetic engineering. You could probably ask her anything. She traces her love of Iceland and her fascination with the Viking Age to a college class she took on comparative mythology. She holds a master's degree in comparative literature with a special interest in the Icelandic sagas. She learned to read Old Norse in graduate school and can read and speak some modern Icelandic as well, having visited the country more than 30 times since 1986. After publishing a memoir about buying horses in Iceland in 2001, she turned to writing books full-time. In 2003, she moved from central Pennsylvania to a 100-acre farm in northeastern Vermont. There, with her husband, the author Charles Fergus, she keeps a small herd of Icelandic horses and an Icelandic sheepdog. She blogs regularly on Viking and Icelandic topics and enjoys discussing all things Icelandic on Facebook. Since 2013, she has offered yearly history and horseback tours in collaboration with the company Hestaland. She is active in the International Icelandic Horse Community, being an editor of the U.S. breed magazine, the Icelandic Horse Quarterly. Finally, she sits on the board of the Leifur Eriksson Foundation, I hope I didn't say that too poorly, which has given $3.75 million in scholarships to Icelandic and American graduate students since its founding in 2001. Please welcome Nancy Marie Brown.
So as the very nice writer for 7 Days who reviewed this book last week said, endearingly, she's a real Iceland nerd. It was nice of him to say endearingly, but yeah, I'm an Iceland nerd, and this is an Icelandic sweater. So the book that I'm going to talk about today is my newest one, Looking for the Hidden Folk. And as one of my early readers pointed out, this book is a love song for Iceland. The first time I went there in 1986, I felt that I had found a piece of myself that, if not totally lost, had been long suppressed. I originally conceived of this book as a collection of travel essays based on the journals that I keep every time I take a trip. And I drafted some of the chapters back in 2009. Then in the summer of 2016, on my 21st trip to Iceland, I took a walk with an elf seer, Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir. That winter, my collection of travel essays was hijacked by the elves. Ragnhildur and I took a walk in a lava field that she and her elf friends had protected from destruction when a new road was being built nearby. Let me read you a passage from Looking for the Hidden Folk. We didn't talk much about elves or the hidden folk as we walked, which was odd, since Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir is a famous elf seer. Just how famous was underlined by a call she accepted on her cell phone as we walked. A foreign journalist wanted to know if the elves had anything to do with Iceland's unexpected success that summer in soccer's Euro Cup. Instead, we photographed lava crags and stacks and pillars, Pillows of silver-green moss, caves and clefts, and individual lichen-splashed rocks. It was by turns warm and sunny, and cloudy and cool, a fine summer's day. The breeze was light, just enough to keep the gnats at bay. The land smelled of peat, with hints of salt and sea. We wandered about, pointing out plants. I didn't keep a list, but 2 hours later, back at my hotel when I wrote up my recollections, I remembered blueberry, crowberry, stone bramble, violet, dandelion, mountain avens, buttercup, butterwort, wood geranium, wild thyme, willow shrubs with pale, fluffy catkins, and several kinds of grass, including sheep sorrel, which we tasted. It was sour as limes. Elves' cup moss was the only sign of elves I saw. We listened to the wind sighing in the knee-high willows and the incessant cries of seabirds, black-backed gulls barking, now, 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 and Arctic terns, many terns with their piercing kriya cries. It was the terns' nesting season, so we wandered away from the bay where the birds lay their eggs on beach stones and black sand. We talked about art and inspiration. What is inspiration? Why do some places attract artists and spark creative thought? Why are some places beautiful? And how do you define beauty? And we shared an experience that I still can't explain. As Raghilder said as we left the lava field, now do you believe in elves? Looking for the hidden folk is my attempt to answer that question. And it was a question that seemed to get harder the more I tried to understand it. For years, I found myself wandering through history, religion, folklore, and art, circling back to explore theology, literary criticism, mythology, and philosophy, stopping along the way to dip my toes into cognitive science, psychology, anthropology, biology, volcanology, cosmology, and quantum mechanics. As you heard, I used to work as a science writer, so my quest took some unusual turns. Each discipline, I found, defines and redefines what is real and what is unreal, what is natural and what is supernatural, what is demonstrated and what is theoretical, what is alive and what is inert. Believing in elves, I learned, is a lot like believing in quantum mechanics. It is a way of perceiving and valuing the world around us. All of the travel essays I had been working on, I realized, shared one theme. Icelanders see nature in different ways than I had been taught to see it. In Iceland, where the weather and the geology are as fantastic as anything Tolkien thought up, the imagination is set free and the mind is urged to pay attention. In Iceland, I felt more alive, more open to wonder and beauty. Because to the Icelanders I met, the world around us, every rock and every hill, is inhabited. By elves, yes, but also by stories. At heart, looking for the hidden folk is about the power of stories. Stories shape how you see the world. They determine not only how you think of elves, but how you think of such real things as hills and mountains and volcanoes. The stories we tell protect a place or permit its destruction. That's why it seems to me that we make a critical mistake when we laugh off an Icelander's belief in elves. We assume we agree on what each of us means by the words belief and elf. Think about it this way. If Icelanders are crazy to talk to elves, are Christians crazy to talk to God? What immaterial beings are we allowed to believe in, and who is allowed to do the believing? In 1974, an Icelandic psychologist conducted a survey on spiritual matters. Of those who responded, 5% had seen an elf, while 33%, quote, entertained the possibility of their existence. In 2006, the University of Iceland conducted a similar survey. Again, 5% said they had seen an elf. This time, more than 50% entertained the possibility of their existence. Let's put those numbers into context. According to recent surveys, 10% of Americans say they have seen a UFO, and 48% of Americans are, quote, open to the idea that alien spacecraft are observing our planet. Or look at it another way. 81% of Americans say they believe in God, and 64% are convinced that God exists. So is an elf more like a UFO, or is an elf more like God? For folklorist Terry Gunnell, who organized the 2006 Elf Survey, the most striking result is that in spite of the radical changes in Icelandic society since 1974, the Icelanders' traditional beliefs about elves had remained nearly the same. They were, he concluded, deeply rooted. The idea that some people can see elves and others cannot does have a long history in Iceland. When Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir wrote to the mayor on behalf of the elves living in the lava field in 2013, she called herself sjáandi, a seer. She did not have to define the term. As the Lutheran bishop of Iceland wrote in 1570, elves are invisible to us unless they wish to appear. Yet the properties of certain men's eyes are such that no spirit can ever escape their sight. What are these properties? No one knows. Then again, seeing itself remains somewhat of a mystery. According to neuroscientist Chris Frith, the brain creates the world. From the very limited and imperfect signals provided by our senses, from our experiences and our expectations, from what we've been taught and what we've read, the brain creates a prediction of what ought to be out there in the world. Eyesight doesn't answer the question, what is this? But instead, what is this like? Says neuroscientist Moshe Bar, our perception of the environment relies on memory as much as it does on incoming information. For this reason, the elf Ragnhildur Jónsdóttir may not look like any elf you might see. Elves have always been shapeshifters. The word is a bottle, the concept a liquid. Or perhaps it's just that we see what we've been trained to see, what our education allows us to see. What image comes to mind when I say elf? Do you see Santa's toy makers, the Keebler elves, Tinkerbell, the Tooth Fairy? The elves Ragnhildur sees, or at least those in the illustrations of her books, look much like people, though they may be dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Some are tall, some are small. Some have pointy ears, and some have green skin, and some look like trees. In the earliest stories, in English or Icelandic, elves are like gods and goddesses. Think of Tolkien's Galadriel, as so beautifully acted by Kate Blanchett. In the tale of Thomas the Rhymer from the 1200s, the elf queen is a beautiful lady on a white horse who kidnaps Thomas and turns him into a sex toy. It was Shakespeare, writing in the 1600s, who shrank the fairy queen to no bigger than an agate stone, the gemstone in the ring on a rich man's finger. Rather than riding a white horse, she comes in a chariot made from half a hazelnut shell and the gauzy bits of grasshoppers' wings. Where once elves were godlike, now they're insect-like. In the earliest Icelandic texts, elf and dwarf and troll are used interchangeably. We really have no idea what these words mean. All are used, writes folklorist Arman Jakobsson, somewhat like a modern anthropologist might use the term God or deity. All that's clear about Iceland's elves is that they were once worshipped. Elves were declared evil by the Christian Church in the early 1200s, around the same time that these poems and stories were first written down. Elf seers were denounced as witches, and in some countries were burnt at the stake. In our day, elves are not so much evil as trivial. Our world has been disenchanted. Everything can be understood by science, we think. Everything can be tamed, even if we haven't tamed it or understood it quite yet. As sociologist Max Weber predicted in the early 20th century, soon there will be no more mysteries, no more magic, no more wonder. Ludwig Wittgenstein found that to be a serious problem. His philosophy, says historian Michael Saylor, awakens us to awe, possibility, difference, and a humble acceptance of the provisional nature of our understanding. These are the kinds of things I think about when I'm in Iceland. Though I've never seen an elf or troll, I've had several encounters with the supernatural while traveling in Iceland over the last 35 years. Once while crossing the cold desert of the island's heart on horseback. Here's how I describe that experience in looking for the hidden book. My horse's name was Valor. Riding Valor, I had marveled at the free-running herd strung out in front of us, single file, 100 horses silhouetted against the sand, gray, black, chestnut, dun, pinto, palomino, roan, bay, their lively legs blurring to wheels as they raced along, a line of moving color against a completely still landscape of barren ground, silver lakes, ageless mountains, the icy dome of Hofsjökull Glacier cutting the clouds ahead, the endless gray sky. Nothing changed all day but that pattern painted by the running herd. Nothing moved except ourselves. No sheep, no tractors or jeeps or ATVs went past, all of which had met us on the first day of our ride as the road and the riding track crisscrossed. But we were not alone. This night's lodgings were sparer than the last. Fewer rooms, each with more beds. I was tardy unpacking and had to bunk in the dining hall. Lounging there, jotting notes, I felt eyes on my neck. I turned to see Hofsjökull outside the windows, stretching across 3 of them and around the corner, like an intelligence looming between earth and sky, gleaming yellow-white, unlike anything real, brilliant, misshapen, awake, a rising moon in wintertime, its edges blurred and shifting, it seemed to breathe. It drew me outside in spite of sore muscles. I walked dead away from it, across the tussocky field to the gravel banks of the glacial river. The day was warm now that the clouds had lifted. I took off my boots to wade. The water was not icy in the shallows over black sand. It made me want to strip and bathe, but I was not quite alone. Other riders were about, one man perched on a rock right around the corner. I had never bathed naked in a glacial river before. I had never thought to do anything remotely like that on all my many trips to Iceland. I waded on, looking for a secret spot. Wind sang in my ears. A golden plover called, bee, 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 bee. The roar of the river was louder than either wind or bird, but somehow so constant as to mimic silence. A shadow rushed across the sun. I shivered and looked up. Unknowingly, I had turned a circle. The glacier was right in my face. Wings of black cloud rising behind the ice warned me the fine weather wouldn't last. But how long did I have? There was no scale here. I could not guess how far or high that ice cap was. I walked barefoot across the warm black sand, braided with turf, soft and spongy and squishy with goose droppings. I decided to ignore their prominence. They felt nice between my toes. I picked up a goose feather. A series of jagged peaks beside the glacier puzzled me. They were covered top to toe with snow, while the mountains in line with them were wholly snowless and blue. Aha! I was seeing only the tips of high snow-capped peaks, their bases hidden beneath the horizon's curve. The glacier was half hidden as well. The black clouds flew closer. I picked up 3 rough, rounded black rocks to remember the river by and let fly my goose feather as a gift in return. I quickened my pace and was startled to see sheep tracks way out here in the wild. The river now ran a greenish gray, milky with silt, its swirling current deadly fast. The sand petered out. I hauled myself up the high, grassy bank, startling geese and goslings, and saw nothing at all around me but river, mountains, ice, and sky. No hut, no horses, no signs of human life. As if I'd stepped through a door into another world, a door into other time. Obviously, I did make it back. But that was a feeling that I've never forgotten, a feeling that brought home to me how insignificant I really was, and how vast and timeless and beautiful and dangerous the earth could be. This feeling of being drawn toward a magic mountain is universal. Other writers feel it about Mount Ararat in Turkey or Mount Antake in Japan. The word one writer uses is not magic, but holy. Another word that applies is wonder. Wonder is an emotion. According to philosopher Jesse Prince, it's wonder that produces both religion and science, as well as art. The 3 institutions that are most central to our humanity, he says, are united in wonder. They are not in conflict. They are not either or. Each allows us to transcend our animality, he says, by transporting us to hidden worlds. It's wonder, he argues, that makes us human. That sense of wonder is what I want to share with you in Looking for the Hidden Folk. We all tell stories. We always have. But we don't always take responsibility for the effects of our storytelling. The purpose of a story is not to pass the time. The purpose of a story is to help you lead a good life. In Looking for the Hidden Folk, I invite you to join in intimate conversation about how we look at and find value in nature. I hope to reveal how the words we use and the stories we tell shape the world we see. I argue that our beliefs about the earth will preserve it or destroy it. Scientists name our time the Anthropocene, the human age. Climate change will lead to the mass extinction of species unless we humans change course. Iceland suggests a different way of thinking about the earth, one that to me offers hope. Icelanders believe in elves, and you should too. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, sir, for having me and us for this evening. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective on this evening. I'm writing a memoir now, which is called Better to be Lucky Than Smart. And the first 2 quotes on the facing page are by Kierkegaard, which is one cannot understand one's life. One has to live. One can only understand one's life looking backwards, but one must live it forwards. And the second is from a Tammany Hall politician named George Washington Plunkett, who said, "I saw my opportunities and I took them." I never set out to be a writer. I love books. I grew up in a library. Family loved books. I used to read myself to sleep with dictionaries. I love words like penury, platitudinous, and pusillanimous. But in high school, I wasn't on the yearbook. I wasn't on the newspaper, and writing was tough. Writing was hard. And I fell into journalism after 3 wrong turns as a putative Foreign Service officer, a banker, and a law student, and said, no, none of those are for me, and they didn't like me either. But I had a college friend who said, well, go try the City News Bureau in Chicago, which was really a training ground for journalists, and it was owned by all the newspapers in the city, and it was really boot camp, really for journalists. And that really changed my life. And so I started really using words professionally and trying to describe what a murder scene was like, what a fire looked like, and calling that in to rewrite editors at the City News Bureau. And because the job was at night, my shift ran from 5 to 2 in the morning, and then I'd have to have a couple hours to sort of regroup and drink. But I get up in the morning, I couldn't sleep during the day, so I wandered around Chicago. What do you do? Well, I bought a camera. I started taking pictures. And suddenly there was another epiphany where I was able to think, well, in one case I was writing about things with words, and in this case I was taking images. And it grew on, and I decided, well, I would try to be a photographer. And I apprenticed myself to a couple of photographers in the city. And then I set out to be a newspaper reporter or a newspaper photographer. Well, I didn't have a really good portfolio. And I thought, well, what can I do? And what do I know about it? And I had this dream, or this wild idea that, well, I did know something about Parris Island. I knew something about Marine Corps boot camp because I'd been through it. So I write to the Marine Corps, this is Tet Offensive, 1968, and say, can I come and follow a platoon through Parris Island for 12 weeks? Thinking, well, they're not going to do that. But they did. So I went and spent the next summer at Parris Island and put together a book of some 120 photographs and 12,000 words of text. And I used it as a job application. But I got to do this because, again, being better to be lucky than smart, one of the guys in my platoon worked for Doubleday in New York. And I said, when? What shall I do? He said, well, Harold Kubler is our military editor. Send it to him. So I sent it to him, and after about 6 months, they said yes. So they gave me a contract, and so here I am. I'm a photographer. I'm doing, good stuff there, and they sent me to places like Israel and Norway and South Chicago, and that was really exciting. Well, I'm walking. So this is 1970. I'm walking through the University of Chicago campus. I lived just 3 blocks away, and all of a sudden I see this professor of mine from college, and I had majored in Middle East history, so I knew him. And I said, Polk, what are you doing here? He said, well, I'm the president of the Adlai Stevenson Institute, which is a private think tank was set up after Adlai Stevenson died. And he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm a photographer for the Sun-Times. And he looked at me, his eyes got really big as saucers, and he said, how would you like to ride across Arabia on camel, 1,200 miles? We'll go from Riyadh to Oman. And I said, no, you're shitting me, this is not true. But it was. And he had this dream of being, sort of Well, it was going to revisit the northern. This is not the really tough desert in the south, but it was still pretty tough. Our desert was the Nafud, to go from Riyadh to Oman, 1,200 miles, and his pitch to the Saudi government was he wanted to do a new translation of a very famous pre-Islamic poem called the Golden Ode. And he said, well, you can take the pictures. There are only 72 verses, and you can do a picture for each one. So essentially that's what we did. And it had, the adventures you would think. We got lost, we ran out of water, we had bad guides, the camels died, blah, blah, blah. But we got there. And we got to Oman, and then we went on to, well, first we went back and had an audience with the king, and the king, unsmilingly, said, well, that's good. So they went to Beirut, where Polk knew the Christian Science Monitor correspondent, John Cooley. And he said, what have you been doing? Well, we've been going across Arabia. And he scribbled away, away. So we flew back to the United States, and 2 days later, on the front page of the Christian Science Monitor is an article saying, Vanishing Camels. It's about us. Well, we thought that's pretty cool. We strutted around for it. So then we get a letter from an editor at A.A. Knopf in New York, big cheese publisher. And he said, have you let the contract for your book? So we sort of kept our mouths shut and said, well, no, we haven't. So we already had this contract with the University of Chicago Press to do this poem. So here we have 2 books out of one trip. I mean, how lucky is that? So that set me on the. Then along the way, I get to meet Chris, and that leads us circuitously to Vermont. And so I then try to write a couple of books which never get published. I spent a year in West Virginia trying to write a book about miners, which ended up, I thought I was going to be James Agee and Walker Evans together, but I wasn't as good as either of them in their craft, and I couldn't really have a good message, and it was a book that deserved not to be published, but it was also a good learning experience. And so then what did I do next? I worked for 3 newspapers, one in New Hampshire, one in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and one back in Burlington, Free Press. And then happened to be, again, another dumb chance, happened to be hiking in the Green Mountains with an old friend of mine from college and a guy who worked for the Times. And this friend from college had become a professor of education at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And he was really interested in worker-owned businesses and workplace democracy. And I said, well, look, let's try to do a book together. I know the people at Knopf, and at least they'll answer the letter. So we wrote a letter to them, and they accepted it. So we spent the next 2 years going around, traveling to 14 or 15 states. We went to Europe, went to Germany, went to Yugoslavia, Sweden, to write what's basically a study of worker involvement in businesses of all kinds. And that was, again, how'd that happen? We worked hard at it. And I know it sounds crazy, but while we were going back and forth with the editor at Knopf, I was starting to make homebrew. And that was at the very beginning when you couldn't even make homebrew. It wasn't even legal, but it got legal. But I would take bottles down to Ash Green, the editor, and he said, well, I've been hearing about this stuff, about homebrewing. And why don't you do a book about that? Sort of a how-to book. And so, yeah, signed another contract. So here I am. Meeting nowhere with 3 books at Knopf. I'm not going to say no, but it was pretty exciting. And so we wrote this book, or I wrote this book, and it went through, probably sold 20 or 25,000 copies. And I would get calls from people all around the country saying, I read your book. How do I do a brewery? And I said, didn't you read the last chapter in the book, which is called Home to Homebrew? Because I just want to do homebrew. I'm not smart enough or wealthy enough to have a brewery. Well, that book launched probably 3 more books that I did, you could roughly say, about my hobbies. So I really think I've had 5 hobbies in my life: brewing, fishing, singing, running, and beekeeping. So kind of the next, and I'm not doing these sequentially. I mean, they're just, they grow out of, I don't know, some funny moss that I really look back and I say, I had to have some project like this, and a few of them didn't work, but it was always engaging to be looking at some way of putting a block of experience, not always in the first person singular, but at least a block of experience between the covers of a book. And so one of the books became, we call it Bees Besieged, or I call it Bees Besieged, and I went all around the country, 20 states, to talk to people about the state of the beekeeping industry around 2002 and 3. So it was not a how-to at all. It was really, no one else had done this. I thought this was something to do. And then Chris put me on, when she was the head of the Museum and Gallery Alliance, she put me onto the American Museum of Fly Fishing down in Manchester. And I just went down there one day to look, and I was going through their library. They had a lot of presidential stuff. They had the fly box of John Quincy Adams. They had a book by Herbert Hoover. They had a book by Grover Cleveland. They had one of Jimmy Carter's fly rods. And I had gotten sort of interested in the intersection between fishing and politics when I was in the legislature, and I was out fishing one afternoon and looking up at the State House, and I started thinking in my mind, what are the other similarities between politicians and fishermen besides lying? And so this gave me this excitement to go and go further. And I spent a couple of years, 3 years, working on that book. Went to the National Archives, went to 3 or 4 presidential museums. I interviewed George H.W. Bush. I corresponded with Gerald Ford. So I got that kind of actuality, as they say in television, and put together, which, I think it's, I don't know if it's my favorite book. But I can read something from it, since we're supposed to be reading something. Shall I do that? 3 pages? Okay. This is after I've been fishing and had this idea, and I said, when I was teaching school, so this is what I was doing in the summers. Said my fondness for fishing during the time I was teaching did not slacken. At every opportunity, I fished the rivers of the state from Canaan in the northeast to Bennington in the south. It was on a trip to the Batten Kiln one June day that I decided to drop in at the American Museum of Fly Fishing. The museum had been founded in a spare room at the Orbis Company store, but over the years it had established an independent presence and grew to have a $400,000 annual budget. The museum's director, Don Johnson, was a big, friendly fellow who loved Hemingway and hockey, as well as fishing, and who had an encyclopedic knowledge of such minutiae as the nicknames of British Army regiments. He turned me loose to wander through the exhibits of reels, rods, fishing gear, prints, and paintings of salmon and trout fishing. As with most museums, the bulk of the collection was stored away, over 1,500 rods and reels and a library of some 3,000 books. Among them were not just the classic texts of such anglers as Robert Barnwell, Roosevelt, Roderick Hay Brown, Arnold Gingrich, Ernest Schwiebert, and Lee Wolf, but many other articles and volumes and artifacts as well. And John Matheson, the museum curator, also pointed out John Quincy Adams' fly wallet with flies from the 1830s, fly box from Herbert Hoover, and fly rod donated by both George Bush and Jimmy Carter. Other presidential materials included Carter's An Outdoor Fisherman, an outdoor journal, which I knew about, that recounted both his fishing philosophy and enough details of his joy-filled excursions around the globe to keep any fisherman entertained and envious. Two other books caught my eye, one by Grover Cleveland and one by Herbert Hoover. Sitting down at Mathewson's pin-neat desk, I slowly turned the age-stained pages of an autographed copy of Cleveland's fishing and shooting sketches. In Gothic prose, he described the joys of fishing, and in one memorable passage defended his chosen recreation against the Philistines. The narrow and ill-conditioned people who snarlingly count all fishermen as belonging to a lazy and good-for-nothing class, and who take satisfaction in describing an angler's outfit as a contrivance with a hook at one end and a fool at the other, have been so thoroughly discredited that no one could wish for their more irredeemable submersion. And in his Fishing for Fun, Herbert Hoover laid out all the reasons why angling is good for us, to wash your soul, and good for society by quoting a 4,000-year-old Assyrian tablet. The gods do not subtract from men's lives the hours spent fishing. There were several other articles on presidential fishing and implying that many of the chief executives had fished at one time or other. The germ of a book began to form. Impulse became resolve. And within a month, I was at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York. There would be dozens of other stops over the next 4 years. My fascination, in fact, I came up with 3 chapters, ideas, in just one day at the museum. That was probably the greatest writing day I ever had, or at least research day. My fascination with presidential fishing itself became a fishing expedition, nay, scores of fishing expeditions in their variety, excitement, disappointments, and ultimate catch. The nibbles and strikes were not just how presidents fished and whom they fished with, or what they wrote about their experiences. There were gems of writing, like the whimsical correspondence between Grover Cleveland and his friend, the actor Joe Jefferson, or George Washington's testy letters to suppliers of his fishing equipment, or Jimmy Carter's intervention in a dispute over the labeling of imported flies. Just as interesting were the ways in which the public, press, and friends responded to presidential fishing. There were dozens of editorial cartoons about presidential fishing per se, and hundreds more that used fishing as a metaphor to treat the issues of the day. In various presidential archives were thousands of letters and gifts sent by ordinary citizens to offer advice, fellow feeling, or invitation to fish on a favored pond or stream. Presidents, I found, had fished everywhere. In Georgia sloughs, on Pennsylvania streams, Adirondack lakes, Kentucky creeks, Wisconsin, Oregon, Colorado, Wyoming rivers, off the coast of Maine, Florida, and Texas, in Alaska, and off the Galapagos, down the Potomac, and up the Amazon. They had lodged in luxury and tented in simplicity. They had pursued the lordly salmon and the lowly perch. They had caught bluefish and trout, tarpon and bass, pickerel and cod, shad and herring, grouper and perch, catfish and pike. In many ways, the fishing presidents have encountered the same experiences as the rest of us. They have brought home their limit, and they have been skunked. They have killed fish, and they have released others to fight again. They have told the truth, and they have lied when they could get away with it. They have been torn between competition and contemplation. They fished with cronies, and they fished alone, the Secret Service notwithstanding. Yet presidents have also had fishing experiences that were uniquely presidential. Calvin Coolidge had Secret Service agents shoo away anglers who dared to fish waters reserved for him. Dwight Eisenhower failed to catch any of the hatchery trout dumped into a Vermont stream the night before his arrival. And only a former president like Jimmy Carter could compare the theft of 2 prized fly rods to defeat in a national election. Fishing has never been a partisan sport. Men of both parties enjoyed it. Democrats Cleveland and Carter loved to fly fish. Republicans Coolidge and Bush were happy with bait. Neither was it elitist. Only desperate campaign workers would coin the 1936 slogan, Give me a fishing pole and call me Roosevelt. At its most elementary, this is a book of anecdotes about the presidents and their fishing, how they began to fish, where they practiced it, and what they said and wrote about it. On a more intellectual level, this book is a thematic exploration of the relationship between the presidents and the public through the experience of recreational fishing. It examines the president as a cultural icon. In the late 20th century, Americans are ambivalent about the appropriate demeanor of their presidents. We want presidents as remote as royalty and as close as next-door neighbors. We want soaring speeches, and we are titillated by locker room expletives. Most of the public cannot imagine setting trillion-dollar budgets or planning wars or log rolling with Congress, but they can imagine how it feels to hook a striped bass or lose a trout. This book is about presidential recreation, not statecraft, although the inescapable backdrop of war and peace, boom and bust, promise and deceit, and the aching, lonely responsibility of the office gives many of these fishing stories their luster and life. When presidents themselves equate angling with democracy, as Hoover did, fishing is great discipline in the equality of men because all men are equal before fish. What better excuse could there be to go fishing? So that was one of 5 or 4 books that I did. Am I running out of time?
I'm not timing you, so.
5 minutes?
Already, yeah.
Okay. So there was that group of books that came along serendipitously. But I realized I didn't have all this I didn't have all, what do I want to say, talent for just keeping writing books that I would just write alone. So I went after other people to write them with them. And but that meant sort of two tiers of persuasion. I had to persuade them, A, that they had something to say, and B, that I could help them do it. And so the first one was this working together, and then I had a really good friend. We ran marathons together, but he'd been was working for Green Mountain Coffee Roasters, and had become a really influential guy in the coffee industry, and in fact was president of the Specialty Coffee Association, which is a big industry trade organization. But he really cared very much about the farmers. That's what he really cared about, not the price of coffee, not the profits at Green Mountain, but the farmers who were producing it. And I said, Rick, how about helping you tell your story? And it took 3 or 4 months to get him to fall for this. And then basically we sat down and with a tape recorder for a couple of years, every other Sunday, every third Sunday. And I would type up what we said, what he said, and we put it together in this nice and well-received book called Brewing Change. Well, then the next one was similar in that I had a singing buddy, professor of art history at UVM, and he had he'd written his PhD on a group called the Voyages, who were artists just before the First World War. And then their Canadian exemplars, particularly, and there was a great collection of Canadian war art from the First World War, put together by Lord Beaverbrook. And Bill Lipke, my to-be co-author, lost the race with a woman teacher from British Columbia to write the first book about that collection. And so he was sort of bummed out, and but he had a lot of stuff. And I said, Lipke, come on, I'm going to help you do this. And I'll be your amanuensis. I will help, I'll ask you the right questions. Plus, we're now in the middle of the sesquicentennial of the American Civil War. So let's write a book that compares memorialization in the First World War, primarily the Canadians, and how the Americans, the North, memorialized their Civil War dead. And so we produced this book called Grafting Memory, which, dare I say, is a pretty good book. Now, did it come about, is it going to sell 1 million copies? No. But it was really exciting to sort of help him do what he was doing, but then introduce this new block of information and then go back and forth working on this together. And I guess the third one in this category would be the third edition of my beer book I did with a friend. And in the middle of doing this version of the brewing book, we started our own brewery. So we could call this book not making beer, but from subtitles from homebrew to the House of Fermentology, which is the name of the brewery we built and which we then sold to another brewery a couple of years ago. So that was fun. And then, you know, another 4 books I did with Frank Bryan, not just Real Vermonters Don't Milk Goats, but the Real Vermont Owner's Manual, the Out, the secession book, so that was also an interesting sharing because we didn't. Both of our names are on the books, on the books, but he probably did, I guess, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the writing for these 4 books. But that was fine. I mean, you could say maybe he wouldn't have done it without me. So at least I was a hero's helpmate with those. Well, then finally, the last category is sort of ones that I would say where I worked with 3 people as more than writers or less than writers, but also editors, and where the books that we put together, the one with Jeff Danziger on the Full Vermonti, which was Vermont's answer to Trump, we went out and got 20 people to write essays about how their perspective was. Then I wrote about 10 or 12 small essays in it, and then Danziger did the cartoons. So it was more than just 2 people writing these books. And then the next one was a book, a history of Vermont beekeeping. And Ross Conrad and I had been beekeepers I've been a beekeeper longer than he had, but he was a better beekeeper because he was doing it professionally. But we decided that this would be a great thing to do because he lives in Addison County, which is the center of beekeeping in Vermont. And so we put it together, but we also had the help of 4 other beekeepers who at least wrote some of the sections. So again, it isn't just our work, it's a collective venture that was probably better because of that. And then the most recent book is one I did with Don Hooper. Don Hooper had been a legislator. We'd gone on the legislature the same year. And then he became Secretary of State, and then he left that to work for the National Wildlife Federation. And all along the way, he kept doing a lot of cartoons. And so we decided we'd put this together. And this is a collection of, I mean, there's not a lot that's original here. We got an original introduction from Jeff Danziger, but a lot of it is a collection of humor from humorists in Vermont's history. Some of them very funny. And in fact, if you're really good, I'll read you one from Rusty Louise. Put in this other one. Okay. But this will give you, it's probably half or 2/3 us, and then the other third is other people like Rusty. Okay, so this is Rusty telling you how to tell a joke. Okay. Laughing is curious. How, why, something you hear, read about, think about, or see cause your body to conjure up a laugh? I certainly don't know. And that's fine. It's not my job to know. My job is to make folks laugh. That's why I think I'm often approached by random people who want to tell me a joke. Every now and then, I'm thrilled someone comes along with a really good one. Most often, the jokes folks tell me fall a little flat. I'm not complaining. It's not their fault. And I'm not saying they aren't necessarily good at telling jokes. It may be I'm not easily amused, at least not by jokes. As a public service, the following are tips that you can work on that might make your joke telling more effective. Don't start your joke by saying, here's one you'll like. Don't approach the joke tellee, all proud as if you're about to whisper to them the cure for cancer. Know the joke you're telling cold. To say, oh wait, I forgot how it goes, is not acceptable. Remember, effective joke telling is serious business. Failing to prepare is preparing to fail applies here. Do not get up too close in the physical space of the person you're telling the joke to. And regardless of the space left between you and that person, you should have good smelling breath. Do not telegraph the punchline. In other words, tell the joke. Let the joke work on its own. Do not discount your abilities. Oh, I heard this joke, it was funny, I'll tell it to you, but I'm not really very good at telling jokes. Every time Pavarotti had a cold, he didn't hold up a sign that says, I know a song, it's a good one, I'll sing it for you, but I have a cold. If you want to tell a joke, commit. Besides, making excuses puts the attention on you, not where it should be, which is solely on the joke. You don't need to smile the whole time you're telling a joke. In fact, don't smile at all, unless you're playing a character in the joke, and that character is a smiler. If you must tell a dirty joke, be sure your audience is game. I think dirty jokes are less funny, but it's all subjective. Vary the tempo of the joke. Don't rush it, and don't end each line with, you got it? So there's this dry fern talking to a cat. You got it? Hey kitty, can you give me some water? You got it? Don't do that. You got it? Once you've reached the crucial moment before the punchline of the joke, burp, cough, wheeze, barf, cry. Do all those things if you must, but please, please don't laugh. It can work if you tailor the joke or change the words to fit your telling abilities and overall sensibilities. But you should, as much as possible, tell the joke in the manner in which it was intended to be told. Most crucial is for you to remember that you're not funny. The joke is. Now see how many of the tips you can utilize while telling the following joke. A guy got a new hearing aid, was all happy and proud, bragging, and told his friends, hey, I got a new hearing aid. The friend says, what kind is it? The guy says, it's 10-15. That's a perfect joke to hone your skills, because all you have to do is say the words. Thanks. As my dad used to tell me as we walked down the path to my car, make them laugh. Okay, thank you. One more thing. First, I was going to quote Gloria Steinem had a wonderful line. She says, the best part about writing is having written, but then in my case, it's having a good editor. Without Chris, I wouldn't have written anything. Maybe the thing, the Marine Machine, but after that, she's been the world's greatest editor. And anyone who wants to write has got to have somebody to tell them when they're full of crap. Thanks.
Oh, the little fuzzy bit fell off. That's why it was popping.
Oh, sorry.
Not your fault. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Nancy. I want to invite you to actually do, in fact, have donuts and have cider. It's going to be out there. And then you can buttonhole Bill and Nancy to the degree that they're going to stay and put up with it. But you can have cider and donuts. I'll show you where the actual physical collection of the NEK authors is. And from the books you heard Bill read from, we own them all. We own all of, no, we don't have Nancy's first two books. We will have them before long. And so we will have all of their books. So if you're turned on by what you heard, you can get them here. In many cases, we're buying circulating copies so you can take them home. But you are among the privileged. You can come here and you can go upstairs into the balcony and sit among the NEK authors' books and fondle everything that's up there and read them. And you can't write in them, all that kind of thing. But for now, come out and have donuts and cider. Thank you.